Hello everyone, I'm Hannah Bannock, and today I will be discussing and reviewing the novel titled The Book Thief by Marcus Zuzak. So first off, I'm going to say if you have not read the book, there are spoilers ahead, so if you don't want to hear them, then don't watch this. But when I first read the book, I had no words when I finished. I think that the book is so beautifully written, and I felt every emotion while reading it. I was honestly kind of sad when I had reached the last page. The Book Thief is set in Nazi Germany on a street called Himmel during World War II. The story follows the life of a young girl named Liesel Memminger during the years of 1939 through 1943. But her story is not told by herself, it is told by a narrator named Death. And yes, it is exactly what you are thinking. Death is actually Death. Liesel was brought to Himmel Street by her mother to live with the Hubermans because her mother was going to be taken by the Nazis. Throughout the book, it goes through her life during the war and all of the relationships she makes along the way. Liesel goes through a lot of hardships in this book. First off, she is taken from her mother and watches her younger brother die on the way there. Then she deals with starvation because she is living with a poor family during the war. She's bullied in school for not being able to read, and then finally she watches everyone she's ever loved die within the span of one night. She was the only survivor of the bombing on Himmel Street. But before I go any further, there are 6 main characters that you should know about. So first you have Liesel Memminger, of course. She is the main character, and she has blonde hair and brown eyes. Next is Rudy Steiner. I would say he is probably one of the most important characters. He is the boy who lives next door and becomes best friends with Liesel very quickly. They're pretty much inseparable, spending every day together. He loves Liesel, but she never admits to him that she also loves him back. After that, we have Hans Huberman, or Papa, Liesel's foster dad. You can tell Liesel loved him the most very easily. He would calm her down from her nightmares each night, taught her how to read, and would do anything for her. He also loved to play the accordion. After that, we have Hans' wife, Rosa, or also Mama. She is Liesel's foster mom. She's very strict and loves to curse. She washes clothes for families, very wealthy families, as her job. Rosa loved Liesel, but she also did not show it in the most conventional or nurturing ways that we are used to seeing a mother show her love. Next, we have Max Vandenberg. He's a 24-year-old Jewish man who came to live with the Hubermans. He reads with Liesel and wrote her several stories. He would hide in the basement of their house for a few years, and Liesel grew very fond of Max. She would spend a little time each day whenever she could telling him about the weather that was going on outside, and they would talk about their nightmares, or sometimes they would just spend the day in the basement reading next to each other. And lastly, we have Ilsa Herman. She is the mayor's wife and would get her laundry done by Rosa. She would let Liesel read from the library in their house whenever she would come to give the laundry. And eventually Liesel ends up stealing some books out of the library whenever she has a chance. So there is a movie adaptation of The Book Thief, and I actually have seen it several times before I read this book. And I loved the movie so much, and honestly did not think that the book would be as good as the movie. But I was completely wrong. They are very similar in their content, and the movie does do a good job of following the book, but nothing compares to actually reading it. The details put into the scenes of the book are so well planned out and executed. I am so glad that I finally had the chance to read it, because the movie had left out several chapters that I personally thought were some of the best chapters, especially the chapter where Rosa gives Liesel a book that Max made for her. And in the novel, we get to read this book that Max gave her and see all the illustrations that he put into it. I thought this was a very important part of the book because it showed how powerful and impactful Liesel and Max's friendship was. And here's a little picture of that book that he made for her. The movie also does not depict the last few chapters, starting with the end of the world, part 2, as well as the book. Zuzak writes these scenes of Death's perspective going through Himmel Street and taking these lives one by one. And it's so gut-wrenching, but also so beautiful at the same time. I think Zuzak using Death as the narrator was a great choice, and he did it so perfectly. It gave so many different perspectives and humanizes Death as a character. While reading, I kept thinking to myself, Death has a soul. He is so kind. And I honestly thought of the narrator as a complete human being with emotions too. But in reality, the narrator is just a concept. One example I think perfectly shows this is when Rudy dies and Death says, "He does something to me, that boy, every time. It's his only detriment. He steps on my heart. He makes me cry." Even the full paragraph before this, Death was talking about watching Rudy's life through memories and wanting to try harder when taking his soul. He wanted to be more comforting and warm when Rudy died. Zuzak also used Death as the narrator to add so much more emotion into the story, and it worked, for me at least. I was sobbing in my room when I was finishing reading the book and could barely catch my breath. Even though I knew what was coming from seeing the movie, the details written in the actual book were so much more than I had ever expected, and I could picture everything in my head like a movie. Another thing I found interesting about this book is that it follows the life of a German girl during World War II. Most movies or books about World War II are from the perspective of a Jewish person or a war prisoner. It was very intriguing and thought-provoking. Growing up, Hitler, the Nazis, and the Germans were to blame for the mass genocide of the Jewish race and for World War II. But in this book, while following Liesel, her friends, and the Huberman family, you kind of forget that they are German and a part of all of this. You get to see what a German family who did not support Hitler was like. They hid a Jewish man in their basement for as long as they could. Hans Huberman gave bread to a Jewish man in a concentration camp despite knowing the repercussions of doing such a thing. And then Liesel and Rudy followed suit and also gave bread to some of the prisoners, even though they were starving themselves. And Liesel thinks to herself in the book, was this Germany? Was this Nazi Germany? And that made me stop for a minute and think, because she was questioning how this could happen. They are supposed to hate the Jewish race and never help them because they are German. But here she is with her best friend choosing to give food to them over themselves, even though they needed it as well. I definitely grew attached to these characters and wanted the best for them. I would get so sad or angry when anything bad would happen to them, thinking they don't deserve this. They're good people. While it mainly focuses on Liesel, you still get to see what it was like for some of the Jewish people who were there during the war. Towards the beginning of the book, you get a little insight into Max's life before he goes to live with the Hubermans. On one of the pages it says, for the next 2 years he remained in hiding. In an empty storeroom, there was very little food, there was plenty of suspicion. And then another excerpt from later on, while at the Hubermans, says, he had not seen the outside world for 22 months. And when he does finally see the outside, Max says, there were stars. They burned my eyes. I think that gives a great depiction of how crazy it was to be Jewish during this time, to not be able to go outside and see light like that for over 22 months is crazy. And just to think that the stars were so bright to someone who hadn't been outside for so long. And I think Zuzak does a great job of showing what it was like for both Jewish people and German people during the war. He makes you feel saddened for everyone. And I do want to talk about the title, The Book Thief, just for a minute. Liesel gets this nickname because she steals books, of course. The first book she stole was at the gravesite of her younger brother. And then the second book she stole was at the burning of books after everyone had left. And then lastly, she stole a book from Ilse Herman multiple times. Each time she would sneak into her house through a window and take one book. And she actually never gave herself that nickname. The first time Rudy went with her to steal a book from Ilse Herman's house and he saw what he took, he called her a little book thief, and she ended up liking it so much she wrote a book about her life and titled it The Book Thief. And then since this is also a young adult book, I want to talk about how adolescents are portrayed in this book. So they are seen as a little more innocent and do not have to deal with the hardships of the war through their parents' eyes. Their parents are always encouraging them to have a normal childhood and go outside and play soccer and run around and do all that stuff while they can. But there's also another portrayal of adolescence in this book. So we get to see the parent side, and then we also get to see the kid's side. So the kids actually know a lot more about what is going on and are actually dealing with a lot of stress as well. And I think that gives a lot of credit to adolescents and shows that, there are these things going on and they're not as naive and innocent as everybody makes them out to be, which I thought was pretty cool. And while yes, this book is on the longer side, especially for a young adult book, I think it was very much worth it. I knew going into the book it was going to be very detailed, but I did not expect what I got. The way Zuzak worked through big events and little events in Liesel's life made it seem as though every word was important to the story. Of course, there were some chapters I did not feel were needed or I was more bored with, but out of 80 chapters in this book, and an epilogue, I can count on one hand of those that I was actually bored with. I thought this book was very well written and would definitely give it a 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. And I would definitely recommend it if you haven't read it already. You won't regret it, but make sure you have some time carved out for it because it is pretty long.